My name is Dennis Chastain. I'm a naturalist and historian and have been for the last 20 years a tour guide, take folks on wildfire walks and history tours. But today we're here in the historical room of the Captain Kimberly Hampton Memorial Library in Easley. And I'm going to tell you the story of the Table Rock steps, the mythical Table Rock steps that actually existed, and the origin of the name Governor's Rock on top of Table Rock. Sometime back in the 1980s, a good friend of mine who was managing editor of South Carolina Wildlife magazine called me and said he was reading the journal of a lady who had climbed a set of steps up the face of Table Rock Mountain. And he said, "Do you know where that is?" And I said, his name was Glenn Olin. And I said, "Glenn, it's not possible. It's just not possible to have a set of steps up there." He said, "Well, I'm reading the journal. It had to be there." And I said, "Okay." I said, "You come up to the house. There's got to be some sign of it if there were steps. We'll go find it." So sure enough, he comes up, and we got the naturalist from Table Rock State Park, and we went trooping off up. And their plan was to go to the far right side of Table Rock that you can see from Highway 11, because that did appear to have a little kind of curved slope, and it was a possibility. So we get up there. It's a really tough 2.5 hour hike to get up there. So we finally get up there, and the point where the rock face makes a 90-degree turn around Table Rock Reservoir is a dramatic 1,000-foot sheer drop. And so I was looking for a place to put my walking stick, and I found a perfectly round hole carved in the rock up there. And I said, "Oh, that'd be great." So I just stuck my walking stick in the hole, like a flagpole, and I said, "Wait a minute. Why is there a perfectly round hole up here on Table Rock Mountain?" And I looked, and there was a line of those holes, 2 lines of them actually, that went up the face of the rock. We had found where the steps were, because the historical record that my friend Glenn had said that there were 8 or 9 sets of steps, a total of 150 altogether, but they had fastened them to the rock with iron pins. And lo and behold, you could still see one of the iron pins stuck up there. Well, since that time, and by the way, Glenn Olin, who is still a good friend of mine, is now a senior editor at National Geographic magazine. So, big deal. So I did a little more research on it, and it turns out that the reason they were such an attraction is in 1845, William Sutherland built the Table Rock Hotel. It was during a period, 1840s on up until the Civil War, when coastal planters, South Carolina, mostly rice planters, would just abandon Charleston and the whole coastal area during the late summer and fall of the year. It was called the sickly season. Nobody's real sure what the disease was, but I mean, it was serious enough that everybody just packed up, brought their slaves with them, and went off up to the mountains, all the way from Cashers and Highlands over to Flat Rock, North Carolina. Greenville was a major tourist destination, and so this fellow William Sutherland says, I think I'll tap into some of this tourist traffic, and built the Table Rock Hotel, which was right where White Oak Shelter is now, if you've ever been on the back end of Table Rock Park. It's long gone now. It burned down, I think, in the 30s, but it was an impressive structure, 2-story with a veranda on the top. That was part of my family's, my father's grandparents lived in that area and owned that property where part of Table Rock State Park is now. And he said he remembers the old Table Rock Hotel being there. And so anyway, this fellow William Sutherland had the steps built, and for 50 cents he would take you up on a go-kart up to where the steps are. And I guess, number one, obviously there really was a set of steps that went up Table Rock, and some of the stories are just dramatic. I can envision these ladies from Charleston going up there in their hoop skirts and getting the vapors and having to be carried off the mountain. But they all wrote in very dramatic language what an experience it was.
At a little distance from us, a spring came out of the mountain, and the gentleman, having refreshed us with lemonade, encouraged us to proceed. We walked for a time on the path beaten in its side, whilst perpendicularly above the head of the mountain rose in a ball of solid rock. The steps! The steps! were now our anxious inquiry. for we looked upon this adamantine wall as insurmountable. But happening to observe my brother talking apart to one of the company and following the direction of their eyes, I beheld a party of ladies and gentlemen descending, as it were, from the clouds. Never shall I forget the sensation produced in my mind when I drew the outlines of their figures and the slight penciling of the railing which supported them against the azure sky, and thought that I, too, must be thus suspended between heaven and earth. But to stay behind were weakness to be ashamed of, especially when the other girls of our party gave signs of such tremendous resolution. Not one of them shrieked or fainted, but ran lightly up the steps with most cavalier indifference. Collecting all the energies of desperate pride, I achieved the first flight of steps and clung, trembling, to the only tree which had obtained foothold in the rock. There was yet another flight of steps, more fearful than the first, and I was torn from my friendly tree and arrived safe at the second landing place, to my utter astonishment. But here an almost superhuman difficulty seemed to present itself. A perpendicular line falling from our center of gravity would scarcely have touched the mountain. But there we stood, on an inch of ground, with a sloping rock of 5 or 6 feet between us and the ultimatum of our wishes. Our lives literally hanging by a peg, for by means of these alone we clamber up. The intrepidity and enterprise of Mr. Sutherland have given the view from Table Mountain to the curious world, but he should not have stopped short here. The ladies, at least, would have been more grateful if he had not obliged them to take such a long step.
And when you got up on top of the mountain, up on top of the rock face up there, and then the north face is literally 1,000-foot vertical sheer drop. No opportunity for steps there. There was a cedar tree that grew right on the cleft of the relatively flat part of the rock on the north side, and I guess it was in a little detritus pocket there on the very cleft. And it became a challenge for everybody who went up there, apparently had the time, those that had the nerve would try it, was to walk around the cedar tree. And that took you out to the very edge up there. And everybody who did it carved their name in the cedar tree. Well, there were so many people who carved their name in the cedar tree that it eventually killed the tree. And then people started taking chunks of wood down. But it was quite famous. As a matter of fact, one of the personal journals or accounts of it said a French dance master from Charleston is supposed to have done a handstand on one of the limbs of this cedar tree, which took him out over the sheer 1,000-foot drop. The other feature that was up there, and people called them hunter's cups, and I don't think they're still there. They're extinct now, but there's a spring, believe it or not, a spring up on top of Table Rock Mountain. It's a perennial spring year-round. There's always water there. It's still there. But there was a trumpet pitcher plant that grew there. Now, normally trumpet pitcher plants, like you see down on the coast, and we have one species up here in the Ups country that grows around seeps and places. That one's called sweet mountain pitcher plant. It's about 2 feet tall. These were only about this tall and literally shaped like a cup. And so that was quite an attraction. Everybody had to go and see them. I want to end with one final myth and legend that also turns out to be kind of half-truth. I had heard pretty much all my life that in this fellow William Sutherland, that in celebration of opening of Table Rock Hotel on July the 4th, he had the governors of both Carolinas, North Carolina, South Carolina, attend, and they drug a cannon. Get this, a cannon up on top of Table Rock, and they were going to fire it off in celebration of opening Table Rock Hotel. And Colonel Benjamin Haygood, who's quite famous in Pickens County and served in the legislature and in the Senate, back in the 1840s. He's the one who arranged for the two governors to come. And the story is that they got the cannon up there, and everybody, the multitude is assembled, and they got caught in a thunderstorm. And everybody bailed out and hid in a rock shelter off the backside of the mountain. It's not very far from the trail. If you've ever hiked at the top of Table Rock, as you approach the peak of Table Rock, it would be off to your left. It's a pretty good-sized rock shelter. And the two governors were in the crew that were hiding in the rock shelter there, or taking shelter in the rock shelter. And the governor of North Carolina, who was said to be a portly fellow, struggled to get up there, and he was pretty exasperated, and he took out a fifth of liquor out of the back of his pocket, a little pint bottle, actually not a fifth, but a pint. And he passes it around, and he turns to the governor of South Carolina and says, "Governor, you got a fine state here, but it's a damn long time between drinks." And that's legendary. It's in the WPA Guide to South Carolina. It just keeps getting repeated over and over. Well, I wrote the text for the new historical marker for Table Rock that's at the new scenic pull-off there that the Pickens County did. I guess it's been about a year and a half maybe since they built that. And when you write the text for a historical marker, this is for posterity. It has got to be documented. And so I said, well, I'm going to kind of backtrack that story and verify it. I found out who the two governors were during that period of time. That didn't match up with the names that were in the story, so something that was kind of a red flag. I'm going to cut to the chase and tell you what I found. That never happened. That never really happened. It is all myth. Now, there was a celebration planned, but Pearl McFall, who was a historian in Pickens County in the 40s and 50s, she wrote a book called It Happened in Pickens County. Well, it didn't happen in Pickens County, because she said, yeah, the celebration was planned and the two governors were supposed to be here, but it rained all day and they called the thing off. Now, here's the kicker. So I start tracking down this story about the governor having said it's a damn long time between two drinks. And I just Googled that phrase. Well, it turns out there are 3 states who claim that that's where that happened in their states, and a half dozen governors, including Wade Hampton, is supposed to have occurred while Wade Hampton, who was governor of South Carolina right after the Civil War, is supposed to have said it to the governor of North Carolina while he was in Raleigh, meeting with the governor up there. Somebody had tracked this thing down. It was in a literary journal. This is a peer-reviewed journal. He had dedicated himself to getting to the root of whoever actually said damn long time between drinks. Turns out a Charlotte Observer newspaper reporter made it up. Just made it up. And it was repeated year after year after year in all different situations in Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia. And it never really happened. So, that's kind of the way history goes. We've got about as much myth and legend and oral tradition as we do historical fact. I don't care what you're researching, the Revolutionary War or the Cherokee history or whatever. There's going to be a healthy dose of myth, legend, and oral tradition in there too. Now, my long experience has been there is almost always a kernel of truth in family traditions, oral traditions, myths, and legends. But anyway, that one turned out to be almost totally false. But here's the important point, and that is it is now correctly recorded on the historical marker, because I went the next step and found out why Governor's Rock is called Governor's Rock. The original story was that this party with the two governors that hid out in that rock. I found, and it's in an obscure document, one of the first governors of South Carolina in 1801 was John Drayton, and he was quite the naturalist. He actually wrote a wildflower book, and I bought a copy when I was down in the Caroliniana Library one time. He was an accomplished naturalist too, and one of the first governors after we attained statehood after the Revolutionary War. He wrote in that book that he was with a party of friends on top of Table Rock in 1801. Now, to put that in perspective, that's just 10 years after George Washington. Yeah, that George Washington made his tour through the southern colonies, including South Carolina. 1801, he says he was up on top of Table Rock studying the flora, and there is some really rare flora on Table Rock and out on the rock outcroppings around there. And he got caught in a thunderstorm and hid out with those friends in there. And he says in the statement, and it has ever since been known as Governor's Rock. So now you know the rest of the story.